In our last two lessons, we learned how to solve quadratic equations. We learned first that the easiest way to do it is by factoring. The problem with factoring is that you can only do it if you can factor the quadratic once it's equal to 0. That doesn't happen all the time. Then we learned how to complete the square, which is actually my favorite way. The problem with completing the square, well, let me say the advantage to completing the square is it always works no matter what. The disadvantage is when you have that lead coefficient in front, when the a is not 1, it can be pretty messy and annoying. So as I promised the other day, here is the other method for solving quadratics, which, just like completing the square, works all the time no matter what. And the one advantage to it over completing the square is that it's always the same. It's never doesn't get more messy just because of the lead coefficient or a weird looking b. So here's how the quadratic formula works. For any quadratic equation, again we have the equals 0 is important here. So you've got to start by writing a quadratic equation in standard form equals 0. And the discriminant, which we called d, is equal to b squared minus 4ac. The solution to that equation, or the roots of that quadratic, are, we'll look at this one first, x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of d over 2a. You might be saying d, where did d come from? Well, d was the discriminant. And so if you don't want to calculate the discriminant separately, you can also use this version of the quadratic formula, which is the more famous one, negative b, x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. There's a lot. There's a lot to memorize there. You do have to have that formula memorized. But once you know it, which just means you can write it down on the corner of your paper before you start doing any work, it's actually not very tricky to use. So let's see a couple of examples. We're going to use the quadratic formula to solve these equations. So first, x squared minus 12x plus 6. For the first one, why don't we use the bigger equation? No, actually, we'll use the discriminant equation. So we'll find the discriminant first. Remember, that's b squared minus 4ac. And you might recognize we did these in the last videos, but it's 144 minus 24, which is 120. So that's your discriminant, 120. And as we discussed in the last video, because 120 is positive, but not a perfect square, that means in the end we will have two real solutions that are irrational. So there will be a radical in our answer. No problem. The solutions I should say, x equals, and I can't stress how important that x equals, I can't stress enough how important that x equal is. X equals negative b, sorry, I'll actually put the number in here, negative b, notice how that's negative 12, so those negatives will cancel out, plus or minus the square root of our discriminant over 2a, which is 12 plus or minus, I'm going to try and take the square root of 120, I'm going to try and simplify that one. 120 is 4 times 30, so that's 2 root 30 over 2. Notice I still have this equal sign, which means I'm still carrying that x equals. If you want to, you can write another x equals, that's actually probably better. And then we can do the math there to simplify 12 plus or minus 2 times the square root of 30 over 2. Just be careful, it's very tempting to cross out those 2's, which you can reduce this fraction, but you can't only reduce the 2 from the 2 times square root of 30, you have to divide the 12 by 2 also. When you divide a fraction, you got to remember to divide everything. The way I like to think about it is first you'll factor out a 2, which leaves you 6 plus or minus 2 root 30. Not 2 root 30, just root 30 over 2. And then you can cancel out the 2's. 6 plus or minus square root of 30 are our two solutions in the end. the next one we'll take a look at is number 9. Skip over number 8. And then number 9, remember that we have to have the equals 0, just like when we solve by factoring or when we find the discriminant. So we'll move that 33 over, and then identify the discriminant is b squared minus 4 times a times c, which you might remember from our last video is negative 8. 256 minus 264 is negative 8. So our solution to the quadratic using the quadratic formula is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of the discriminant over 2a. Don't be scared by that negative under the square root. We know what to do with that. It's an imaginary number. So I can reduce the square root of 8 and take out the negative 1. Just remember that because we have an imaginary solution right now, we do have to separate that into a plus bi form. So I'll separate the negative 16 over 4 plus or minus 2 square root of 2 over 4. And I can reduce the 2 over 4 there times I, and that is our final solution.